I'll move on to the next part of this, and this is all around workplace mandatory vaccination. So as I alluded to in my last couple of slides, there's been 4 industries where it's been mandated, being aged care, health, education, and quarantine hotels. And obviously temporarily all of those other industries that are there. But what I'm wanting to talk about now really is mandatory vaccination on an ongoing basis. And I guess, look, there's a few things to consider here. And one of the things that certainly that Safe Work and the Fair Work Ombudsman seem to talk about in particular is the sort of risk of infection. So the question mark for me is going to be, as at December the 1st, I think the best way to look at this is December the 1st onwards, because at the moment we've got temporary orders, and temporary orders should not be confused with permanent requirements. So I think the best way to look at this is from December the 1st onwards. And what I would say is that looking at this, I mean, first of all, there's no guarantee that in December we'll necessarily have very high case numbers, if you want to use that as a yardstick for, how much infection there is. I mean, the case numbers seem to be trending down at the moment, and that's probably, at least some sort of barometer as to how much infection there is out there. So whether you can enforce a mandatory vaccination policy beyond that is probably going to be it could potentially be based on, that's one factor, certainly, how much infection is actually around. Obviously, look, last week we had the New South Wales Supreme Court decision. I'm just going to go in through all these bubbles, because these are all there's some things that go here sort of that kind of support the notion, and some things that go against the notion. But
so one thing just to be clear is you've got so many bodies out there that have a view about workplace mandatory vaccination. And just to be clear what we're talking about, we're talking about workplace mandatory vaccination decisions above and beyond the requirements of the health orders. And what's important to put in context as we go through these bubbles is you've got both state-based organisations and federal bodies who all have a different view, who all impact on the workplace. So, if one particular body says, hey, for example, Safe Work says it's okay, I'm not saying they are, but they say it's okay to implement a workplace mandatory vaccination, and someone doesn't get vaccinated and they get terminated, well, then you've got to deal with the Fair Work Commission. So all of these things are integrated. It's not simple yes or no answer.
Yeah. So look, the Supreme Court decision last week, I would encourage you to, turn off your media outlets when reporting on that, because they'll report it as a massive, how do I put this, that it's all over Red Rover and that mandatory vaccination is okay. Well, that's certainly not the case. The Supreme Court decision went to 2 specific industries and went to largely the temporary health orders, which actually already expired. So the case was about the construction restrictions at the time, and was also about the LGA restrictions at the time. And I believe it also covered, Andrew, it covered a couple of other industries, didn't it? It covered education and one other, wasn't it?
Well, those were the applicants, but the main thing that it was really looking at is 2 things. Did Hazard have the ability to make the health orders that he did make? Did he have the legal right to do so? And the second thing it looked at is whether or not the removal of someone's ability to go to work as a result of restriction of movement, did that in effect equate to mandatory vaccination, or as the government tried to spin it, is it more of an incentive?
Yeah. So I think that the main part of the Supreme Court decision went to health orders that actually were expired. So if you look at it from the applicant's point of view, AFL solicitors and those other applicants who took it, well, the case may not have succeeded, but what they did succeed in doing is getting the government to drop the old orders, because the orders as of the Monday, the 11th of October, were nothing like the previous ones. So it's a very interesting case when you look at it from that perspective. Let's go to the Fair Work Ombudsman.
Just one more point on that. The biggest message to take out of this is, again, it was tested on the health orders. It was not in relation to an individual business making a determination on mandatory vaccination above and beyond what the health orders require. So there's no application for individual businesses. And we've heard from multiple levels of government across this pandemic, well, whether or not they require their employees to get vaccinated is a choice of business. So the point being is this case in the Supreme Court has nothing to do to influence that.
Yep. The Fair Work Ombudsman have said that what their position on this is at the moment is that in some cases, employers may be able to require their employees to be vaccinated against COVID-19. Employers should exercise caution if they're considering making mandatory COVID-19 vaccinations mandatory in their workplace and get their own legal advice. So that's what they're saying. Safe Work New South Wales is saying consideration must be given to legal implications of workplace vaccination mandates, including workplace relations, privacy, and anti-discrimination laws. We don't have any cases in the Fair Work Commission yet that have gone specifically to the case of COVID-19 vaccination. There is a couple that went to flu vaccinations from last year. So again, no Fair Work Commission decision. I'll get to Deputy President Dean in a minute because that's very interesting. Discrimination laws and Australian Human Rights Commission, no cases there yet, so that's untested. The Fair Work Act, I guess what some employers are going to try and run with is that mandatory vaccination is a reasonable workplace directive. Now, whether that's the case or not is going to depend on the circumstances. And, I've had some contact with some clients, and I think that in some situations, I feel that their kind of decisions or wanting to go to mandatory vaccinations, I feel is probably a bridge too far. I just think there's been some industries which are just not, I don't think have the ability to make those positions, but they're either running with them or they don't. I think you'll find a lot of businesses will have a strong view on this one way or another. So, you can only guide so much, but ultimately a lot of these businesses will take their own decisions.
Just before you go on, Clint, the other thing that I think that we've seen a lot of questions and what's creating a challenge for a lot of our clients is, for example, a client may look at something like this and say, hey, look, on the balance, maybe I should mandate workplace vaccinations for my business. But the challenge that they're facing is, well, let's say they've got a transport business and they send out their drivers out to deliver goods. If the workplace that they're going to has that same decision, it has a flow-on effect back to your business, and that's a real challenging one.
Yep. So I'm going to go quickly to Deputy President Dean. So what Deputy President Dean did, there was recently a case, it was Kimball versus, can't remember the business name, but basically what happened, there was a...
Sapphire, I think.
Sorry?
Sapphire, thanks,
mate. Basically, Kimball v. Sapphire. So in the first decision, this particular business, Sapphire, implemented a flu vaccination mandatory policy in 2020. This Kimball was terminated because she did not get a flu vaccination. The matter went to the Fair Work Commission. The initial decision was that the termination was fair and reasonable. Okay, she worked in a childcare facility. Is that right, Andrew?
I think it was.
Was it childcare?
I think it was aged care.
Aged care. Sorry.
Yeah.
One of those two. I can't quite remember what it was, but basically, what then happened was that the case went on appeal to the Fair Work Commission, and when it goes on appeal, the full bench decides whether or not to hear the appeal. Now, in this situation, there was 3 commissioners, 2 voted in favour of basically, well, 2 voted against the appeal, and 1 voted in favour of the appeal. So the appeal didn't materialise. It was 2-1 against. But what was very significant was what was said by the 1 against in that particular decision. And Deputy President Dean went on to say quite a lot of things about it. And one of the things that Deputy President Dean did say is that, and whether you agree with it or not, Deputy President Dean said that mandatory vaccination was in actual fact a very lazy way of actually managing risk of COVID-19 in the workplace. And her argument was that, well, workplace testing, regardless of vaccination status, is a much better risk mitigation position. Look, she went on to talk about a whole range of other things, but effectively, she argued that, look, that by having, mandatory vaccination rules, it was coercion and that it went against human rights. And there was a whole bunch of other things that Deputy President Dean said. But what our take out of that is that if you go to the Fair Work Commission with a case, well, do you really want to be gambling on what commissioner that you get on the day? I mean, if Deputy President Dean's against it, well, then there's probably going to be others that are going to be against it as well. So really, if you're in those 4 industries, well, okay, you're bound by the government's health orders, but if you're not, well, then you want to be really careful looking at a mandatory vaccination policy, because if effectively, as a result of that, you bring someone's employment to a head and terminate the employment, well, then that's where you might end up in the commission. So, and look, it probably does go to the point of workplace testing, and there's probably not enough discussion about this. I mean, I think that businesses are looking at, I think some businesses are looking at mandatory vaccination as a kind of a, I don't want to say it's an easy way out, but a bit of a once-off kind of approach. And as you probably would all know, I mean, transmission still occurs, obviously, regardless of vaccination. So I guess you can make the argument that testing is actually much more effective in terms of, now, do you want to implement testing? That's another thing, because that's not easy in and of itself. You've either got to consider rapid antigen testing, or you've got to consider having people test at a facility once a week. Is that inconvenient? You know, how are staff going to respond to that? But the reality is, if you are really worried about COVID-19, if you're really concerned about managing the risks, well, then you may have to think about things like that. And I think, look, by December 1, we'll probably have a pretty good idea of where things are at. But what we've ultimately been saying to our clients now for some time, which has probably been a little bit against the grain of what others have said, is we've just said to follow the health orders and really no more. We don't see that there's a great argument at this point for mandating vaccinations based on all of the unknowns. I mean, there's so many unknowns in that picture we've presented there. There's so many unknowns.